You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This is Music Mausoleum, our semi-regular mid-month episode that's only made possible by Patreon support, which you can find at patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. But Music Mausoleum is when we focus exclusively on music. So very shortly, we are going to be talking about post-punk and Darkwave Burnout. We have a album review from TELARANA. And I've got a whole bevy of new releases to recommend if you're looking for something new to listen to. So as always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with the other host, Trey. I'm here with a delicious pumpkin beer. Even though I don't drink anymore, I did pick up some pumpkin, and I'm having a beer for the first time in probably a couple years to celebrate the autumnal season, get in the spirit, and hopefully lift my own spirit because I'm not doing too well. But let's talk about music. Since this is our music episode, I thought it would be appropriate to share some thoughts about, well, music.
What? That doesn't make any sense.
So I wanted to comment a little bit on Connor's point from the episode he was on, which was making the argument that modern goth bands sound like they're out of the 80s, as well as something else that's been going around recently, which is conversation around burnout when it comes to Darkwave and Post-Punk. That specifically, I've actually been seeing friends make comments about for the last year or two, but Coralix had a post on Facebook that went kind of viral. I can't remember exactly what it said, but it had something to the extent of, kind of poking fun at the baritone voice and the stereotypical synth of Darkwave and wondering why would anybody be burned out on it.
I mean, like I comment on almost every other music review we do.
Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of want to talk about both of those. So the first thing to Connor's point about bands sounding very 80s, I was talking with Ryan Flint, and he made the point that having a lineage of coherent sound isn't necessarily a bad thing or even a limit on creativity in a negative way. And so thinking about it, if you're coming at it from the sound of the bands, I don't think Connor was talking about production value, right? Because obviously there have been vast improvements in production value. You do get some bands who on purpose sound like they're recording in a studio in the 80s, but the bands are much cleaner in their sound and crisper in the production.
I would also argue the production value in the 80s wasn't desperately bad. I mean, it's not like we're going back to the 50s or 60s. We already had digital production and most of the trappings of the modern studio. We weren't beholden to the vagaries of analog everything, other than the kind of desire to still keep using that, especially within synths.
Yeah.
But we were definitely in a digital domain that is mostly lossless when it comes to transitioning sounds between tracks and mixing them together. So most of the 80s sound wasn't really a production quality thing, but was kind of production tricks that they're playing with. They got kind of enamored by certain studio tricks. One of the big ones, of course, is the famous 80s snare drum. That was a fun mistake that was made. I think it was a Phil Collins mistake. They did something with one of the like the room mic was left on, but it sounded really cool when it was feeding that sound through, and they wanted to capture that, and that's how they got that whole loud gated snare drum sound that the 80s is so well known for. And then of course the synth programming, with synth finally becoming accessible to musicians, where before they were just sort of sequestered in the richest studios or in colleges or government sponsored radio production studios and not accessible to people. So they became widely accessible and people just started playing with them. And that led to a lot of naive synth programming because they hadn't been in depth on how to, or, they haven't been deeply involved with how to properly design sounds, all the factors of music. And they were loving the presets. So there was a lot of preset use, which is fine. I don't have any problem with preset use, but it does mean things can sound cheesy and samey. And of course, now with the 80s revival, those presets are all the vogue again because that's part of what people are trying to capture is that sound.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, I appreciate that. So I guess what he's talking about then would be the sort of rhythms and sensibilities and melodies and tones, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
I think I kind of brought this up, but I think there's more of a diversity of sound in the 80s than people might necessarily assume. I do think there was a narrowing of scope.
Yes.
Yeah. I do think the goth specifically narrowed in its scope through the 90s. But for the 80s, and I think I kind of made this point in that episode, there was a lot of, the dub influence. There was like disco influence and new wave and glam. And I think that kind of gets to the retrospective narrowing, like rose-tinted glasses kind of thing. That's sort of my bugaboo about reductionism and abstraction, that we tend to think of an era or a genre intuitively as kind of static and quantifiable within a small set of rules. And then when you start peeling that apart, you realize there's a lot of fluidity and diversity that was going on.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're looking at modern music, I think death rock is an interesting example right now because it's definitely been accused plenty of times of being redundant to itself, I guess. But I think right now I find it really diverse in a lot of what's going on. You have sort of like Witch Hands, for example, has a very grimy kind of metal influence to it. You have a band like Pawns, which I really like, that has a like West Coast sensibility. Tears for the Dying is another band I really like. Adria had been on the podcast before, but there's like a creeping dread sort of perforating all the music from them. You have bands like Cemetery that rely on that dark punk chaos as a backbone. And then there's a band like Nocturne who infuses like an ethereal sort of sound into the harsh death rock rhythms. So as I was thinking about it, I kind of think there's a quiet death rock resurgence happening. We did our Cemetery Girls review, and I think they were doing a lot of interesting things. And obviously, the complaint about death rock is the trope of the bands who just ape Christian death and Ra's vocals. But that's going to happen with anything. Like gothic rock in the 90s is a great example. Or even, the Darkwave Post-Punk genre right now, which is part of what I think people are burned out on. And so all of that to say, before I talk about the burnout stuff, I just think there is, if you look at only the popular bands, there is a cohesive kind of sound.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because they're popular. A lot of bands that maybe you've never heard of might also sound the same. But taken as kind of holistically, there is, I think, an interesting, some bands are using like Italo disco, which I know is an 80s thing, but it's a different 80s sound. So I think there's a lot going on right now that might be easy to agglomerate. That's a word, right?
It is a word, yes. And it kind of means, I think, what you're implying as well.
I don't necessarily disagree with Connor, but I do think there's a little more nuance than might be implied. And, to the whole metal thing, I think there's just a larger number of bands within the metal genre and goth has always been a smaller community of people. But we talked about Spelling and those kinds of bands.
Mm-hmm.
There's dark sounds in adjacent bands as well that can give you that diversity if you really want to sort of have something similar, but not like goth proper, right? So,
yeah, I mean, as far as the whole discussion around these, 80s revival bands being samey, or I guess was the comment that 80s revival bands are samey, or was it that goth bands today are all 80s revival bands?
yeah, that one.
Okay, the second one. Okay. I mean, I guess you already made the point that, in your opinion, their focus on what is a goth band today is maybe too narrow and is only circling around the ones that sounded like 80s goth, when there is a lot larger spectrum. And I guess I just don't hear that. I mean, through the music reviews we've done, we haven't gotten that many that I felt were. I mean, there is an 80s revival going on right now, just in general. There has been for a good decade or so. And that's in popular music.
It is more 90s now, but
it is getting a little bit more 90s now. But until relatively recently, it's been that big, heavy 80s music revival through popular music and other genres, both R&B, general pop, even a little bit of hip hop, but not that much in hip hop. They didn't really revive any of the 80s hip hop sound as much. But hip hop reutilizing 80s synth pop sounds, like Kanye West's 808 and Heartbreak, I think, something like that. Had a lot of 80s sound to it. So there's definitely a lot of that's been going through in general, and that's just how the music cycle works. Every 30 years or so, you go back to what happened 30 years ago. So in the 2010s, we were in the 1980s. That's just the way things work out. And now that we're in the 2020s, like you said, the 90s are kind of coming to the fore. As far as being, I mean, I agree with your statement as well that the 80s was not necessarily an era of really cohesive sound.
Yeah.
If you were looking explicitly at like core popular synth pop in the 80s, or just new wave, yeah, they did. That's why those are specific genres. New wave in the 80s, synth pop in the 80s. They aren't 80s music, though oftentimes they become bandied about as synonymous with it. But 80s is also the major rise of hip hop, is the major rise of hardcore punk, is the major rise of metal. Those are not sounds that are anything like one another. Electronica had its flourishing there, though it didn't really hit its real stride until probably the end of the 80s, turn of the 90s. You had techno and house early on, but then the big giant explosion when you're getting rave and jungle and trance and ambient trip hop and all that starts coming up later in the 80s and then the 90s. But that's still I've always thought the 80s was one of those sort of inflection points where you have an era of similar sounding music and then it explodes. That's kind of what the post-punk movement itself was, is a reaction to the perceived sameness of traditional punk, which was sort of a harkening back, as the 30-year thing usually predicts, to the garage rock of the 50s and 60s. And very restricted on, we've got to do simple guitar, bass, and drums things with lo-fi production. And post-punk said, fuck this shit, hold my beer, let me involve everything. Let's bring in African music and Caribbean music and Latin music and classical music and experimental music and art rock and all of this, and stop shunning this quote unquote complicated music, and let's just throw it all in this big blender. And then we've got bands like Bauhaus, but also the B-52s and Devo and Robbing Gristle, all in this giant post-punk umbrella, and they sound nothing like one another. And they all, of course, splintered into dozens of now established subgenres like industrial and goth and new wave and synth pop and electro.
And I think that really is the main contention there, is just that if the argument is that, well, goth bands now, whatever subgenre of goth you want to talk about, have melodies and song structure that have been done in the 80s. Well, I mean, yeah, like they did all kinds of things in the 80s.
In the 1880s, even.
It's a bit, yeah. Sorry, I do have a migraine, so I'm really having a hard time thinking right now.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah. No, I think we're definitely in accord here on the idea that, we've been reviewing we generally review new music whenever we do a music review episode. And have I commented on some sounding like 80s? Sure. Has it been all of them or even the majority of them? Not even close. Got lots of different sounds out there. And the ones that were evoking the 80s sounds were explicitly advertising themselves as that, usually, both visually and in how they describe their own sound. Because you definitely know when you look at a album, the album art, if it's got a very stereotypical neon 80s vibe, then they're probably trying to revive the 80s sounds.
Yeah. Like the Jesus and Mary chain, that's another one that popped in my head, like another like different kind of band.
Yeah, I mean that whole thing that went through and sort of spawned alternative music in general with Jesus and Mary Chain and the Pixies and all those bands that came through, and Sonic Youth, Mudhoney, all coming out of the 80s, and nothing like a lot of other stuff around that time. Certainly nothing like the stuff that was popular. Sure, if you listen to the Billboard top hits from 1980 to 1989, there's a cohesion to it. Though even that's pretty varied.
Yeah. That does kind of transition into post-punk and burnout and Darkwave Burnout. I've seen a lot of takes on this. I actually posted about this on Facebook and I had like 70 comments or something. I think I pulled two of the most insightful comments out of that chain. One of them was by Bobbis from the band Hada, and the other was from DJ Hate Meor. Bobbis made the point that music production is driven by necessity in a lot of cases, where you have artists who believe that sort of and we talked about this before, that everyone is kind of a temporarily embarrassed billionaire and are just one hit away from blowing up. So you have this sort of general zeitgeist around Darkwave and Post-Punk, and musicians think, okay, let's jump on that train. And so you get a lot of samey sounding music. So the idea is that artists don't have their material needs met, and they can't just make music. They have to be an advertiser and a web designer, social media marketer. Yeah. And the creative process is kind of stolen from them in that way. Also, I think somebody else made the point similar to that. This has been made, Azzy made this point on the podcast, that it's cheaper, more economical to have two people and a laptop kind of thing. So that also produces certain types of music.
Those limitations are swiftly going away as the production software is becoming more and more complicated. That's and true. People are able to do more and more impressive things with even one person and a laptop than they were able to even dream of with a whole studio setup in like the 70s and maybe even into the 80s.
Oh, that's good. I don't miss alcohol, but that is a good beer. Sorry.
That's all right. Enjoy your beer.
On the other side of things, from the perspective of the listener, Kate Meor made this point about the staleness of the genre from the listener perspective. Basically, they were saying that it can come down to either goths not utilizing a curator or curators being shit at their job. And curators, obviously, by that I mean DJs, podcasters, magazines, music journalists, that kind of thing. You and I have both talked about how poor Spotify's algorithm is for discovering diverse ranges of music. And sort of mostly focused on, I can't remember if we talked about this on the podcast or just in person, but we have a shared playlist where Spotify auto-generates music that both of us are into. And it often puts a lot of the same bands and a lot of the same songs into there. Also, my generated playlists, I go through a lot. And they're very poor. If I want a playlist of music that all sounds similar, it's great. But if I am trying to find new things, or even just a playlist that has a range of goth genres, it's very poor for that. The point DJ Hate Mior was making is that algorithms can't replace someone in the scene that spends hours and hours sorting through music to weed out all the tracks that sound the same. And if you're relying on algorithms, the algorithms are made for massive groups of people with no personal touch, and it's going to be easy to burn out because they don't screen for like a local community or quality or diversity like a DJ would. And the free labor essentially that those DJs and curators do is really essential to the community, because as has been pointed out by these complaints, by like what Connor said and what other people are saying about being burned out, diversity is necessary for the continuation of the scene, because if everything gets stale, you're not going to remain interested. And so I think that's really important, not to harp on curators. I think they do a pretty good job. But as a member of goth, if you're looking for music, don't just like jump onto YouTube and go through recommended videos. Find, even if a local DJ preferably, or people on TikTok like Awfully Sinister or somebody, they're going to be these people that spend a lot of money on music and a lot of time listening to music, and then spend their time recommending music. It's because they have a passion for it, they have a lot of experience, and they're going to open your eyes to something interesting. And that, I actually went into the Sinister Suggestion segment that we have later. That was a little bit of my consideration for trying to pick new releases that are diverse and not really in the Darkwave post-punk spectrum. So hopefully that's helpful. But yeah, I think that was a really good point that they made.
Yeah, I'd also emphasize, when you're looking for those DJs or curators or people, try to seek out ones who kind of listen to other music too, that are just passionate about music in general. Because if you have someone who just listens to goth or darkwave or death rock, or even just listens to post-punk as a broader range of things, there's still going to be a sameness, because that's the definition of genre to some degree, is sameness. Whereas someone who, that may be their focus and they like that dark aesthetic, but they also enjoy listening to all kinds of other things, the wider the palette, the better, because then they're going to find those sort of weird, quirky bands that synthesize multiple things, which you may hate, but you may also find a new thing you love. I mean, that's one thing that I always try to do when I'm searching for new music, is I'll look for random music genre plus dark or goth or noir or something, just to see if there's a dark version of this thing. So, I mean, one of the things I commented or suggested in a Sinister Suggestion many months ago was dark jazz, which I still love, but I've also looked up like dark country, and I've found some great stuff there. I've not really looked up dark hip hop, but I've found some just in general that I like, between like Death Grips and Clipping and stuff like that. There's a lot of good sound designy, industrially based hip hop out there, and a little bit that has some goth bases, but that's less common because it needs that sort of hard hitting thing that industrial gives more than goth usually.
There was somebody I saw, sorry to interrupt, there was somebody I saw posting in a group that said they made goth hip hop or goth rap, which is, it was, it had guitar and drum machine kind of thing. It was interesting. I didn't like it, but and I know people get really upset about, you can't put those two things together, but there are people experimenting with that. Or that other band, I can't remember the name of, that we reviewed, that I thought had a lot of emo influence and you thought had like black metal influence. That kind of thing.
It was the screaming.
Yeah.
The quality of the screaming reminded me of black metal, reminded you of emo.
Yeah. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there are.
That's all right.
There's the bleeding edge. There's that gray line. You can find stuff you like.
Yeah. As far as the whole goth rap thing, I know that there was this whole, and I think it's not really it still is there. It's the whole SoundCloud rap
Mm-hmm.
movement, and a lot of that was usually more advertised as emo rap, in that it was pretty standard rap, but was dealing with emotional topics, kind of like emo.
Yeah.
When emo just started, it was basically just hardcore punk,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
dealing with emotional lyrical content. But the sound wasn't as much different as it became as emo evolved and sort of developed its own identity. It started moving away from that sort of hardcore formula sonically, but held on to the lyrical content that sort of was its core.
I don't want to get too much into it, but I think when it comes to the boundaries and expectations of goth, people get really reactionary, scorched earth to things, because the issue with the SoundCloud rap was there were a few people, like a handful of rappers, who were saying, "Oh, we're goth," and we're goth, and they weren't. Or like with any like pastel goth or whatever.
Yeah, that with Cholo Goth
people
too.
people perceive a threat and go way overboard on trying to excise that from the scene. And I know I complained before about the vibe that the like absolute animosity towards hip hop and rap from goths gives off, a very sort of like tone deaf, almost racially motivated. And we have this reflex to protect the boundaries and perceived norms of the subculture without stopping to consider what we are saying and what we are doing, which I think can lead to problematic takes and almost reactionary positions for the sake of trying to preserve something we see as pure or untainted in a way. I do think it leads to some ill-considered, problematic opinions.
Yeah. I mean, there's also the fact that some of the genres of music that are usually most volatile as far as, inciting a very fervent response from people who aren't already fans, or from people who are fans about stuff outside of it. Hip hop, country, metal, probably punk. Those usually people have strong opinions on them, one way or another. Yeah. It becomes a love or a hate thing. So when you start involving those music and people trying to introduce people to them, you have to somehow break through that sort of knee-jerk love-hate based on, maybe a historical impression of past experiences with a certain genre. And, when it's a genre you're not really into, you generally think it's always the same as what you heard the first time. And you don't really want to try anything new because you hated it once. Why am I going to bother, submitting myself, inflicting that on myself again? Yeah. And I get that. That's totally fair. And I can't expect everybody to be, a voracious listener of new sounds and wanting to try everything constantly. I can't even claim to be that all the time. I try to do it, but there are definitely things that I don't like, but I do try to make a conscious effort of finding things that I've never liked it. Let me try it again. Let me try something new in it. Let me see if they've done any changes in it. Let me check it out again. And sometimes that's led to some great discoveries, and sometimes not so much. But I do try to do that, but it's a conscious effort on my part. It's not something that, if you just want to be a passive listener enjoying sounds that are comforting and you enjoy and, remind you of your youth or you're growing up into music and all that, that's fine. You don't have to do that. But it's when it becomes this vitriol that it's not that you can say, no, I just don't like that and don't listen to it, where you have to tear it down. You have to say it's terrible or it's not music. Another thing that a lot of, not really mainstream, but especially conservative commentators like to throw at rap.
And maybe, I don't want to say racially motivated necessarily, but it's kind of like a punching down thing that I don't like. But there is a long history of racially motivated hatred towards hip hop. Right. So
I'd say it's probably, when it's kind of a version of racism, I guess, but I'd say I'd classify it more with xenophobia.
Sure.
Absolute racism.
Yeah.
Because it's a fear of an other. It's something that is outside of what you consider your norms, what's your boundaries of, in this discussion at least, what your boundaries of what constitutes music or good music. Rap is definitely something very different from the traditional westernized canon of music that developed from, European Western tradition.
Although rock and roll was stolen from black people anyway, but
it was. Well, I mean, the thing with rock and roll was it wasn't quite as big as Divergence. It was still using the Western tradition of music and harmony and melody and rhythm.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying.
It was just emphasizing rhythm a little bit more, whereas rap, at least in the minds of some people, completely eschews harmony and melody, which were kind of the focus of Western musical development. We really let rhythm kind of languish. We aren't a highly rhythmically complex musical tradition. There are exceptions, and that has been changing here and there. A lot of it because of the influence of things like rock and roll and jazz and other, influxes of African traditions into Western musical traditions. But something like hip hop, which is almost entirely rhythmically developed and oftentimes very complicated. In fact, usually as it's been evolving, it's becoming more and more complicated, both in a rhythmic flow as well as the concept of what constitutes a rhyme and a rhyme scheme. You look at the stuff from the late 70s when it started into the 80s, and it was very that sing-songy kind of nursery rhyming sound with a handful of standouts that were pushing the genre forward with more complicated rap, and that became more and more prevalent until today's when you've got some really, really dazzling, head-spinning flows and rhymes you have to that doesn't actually, no, yes, that does work.
Yeah.
How does that work?
I love hip hop.
So, I mean,
I really do.
I do too.
Well, speaking of rap, let's wrap this up.
All right.
Well,
that was terrible.
It was.
But I loved it.
Album review.
All right, so our album review this month is the band. Well, how would you pronounce that?
Augustia, or if you want to translate it to English, it's Anguish. Right? No, that's not the band. Sorry, that's the album.
Yeah, I was going to say the band Telaranya or something.
Telaranya, Telaranya, which I believe is spiderwebs. Yeah.
Yep. And I unfortunately couldn't really find any information or bio or anything about the band other than really the fact that they're from Spain. And that this is their first album as well, at least as far as I could see. So
at least on Bandcamp, because I was looking for the discography link for Bandcamp to see if I could listen to anything else, and I wasn't finding anything.
Yeah. So we're gonna play a track from the album, and then we will see you on the other side. I enjoyed this album. It is, I guess you could classify this as a post-punk darkwave album, which when I get to the end, that may have impacted how much I enjoyed this album. But track to track, I think they modified and adjust the formula in satisfying ways that kind of keep it feeling like a breezy playthrough, not tedious in any way. Track 2, which we just played, what was the name of it? Soledad?
Soledad.
Yeah. Yep. Was probably my favorite. It has a great upbeat pace. You get bass guitar forward, post-punk, and then the star for me is the cowbell, which sounds silly, but it's in a really good groove that's super danceable, and you don't really hear cowbell very often.
They used it pretty tastefully. It wasn't heavy. Yeah. It was not the cowbell comedy routine from Ferrell, SNL from the Blue Oyster Cult. Yeah. But it was used tastefully. It was in there. You heard it, but it didn't stand out as, oh, cowbell. Haha, that's the meme.
Yep. So they follow up that track by switching up the formula again. What is that? Fluoxetina. And that track has an almost industrial sounding kind of drum machine paired with a death rock-esque guitar melody, which to me feels, I've been watching Universal movies, it feels like Frankenstein versus the Wolf, or Frankenstein meets the Wolfman in a lot of ways. The vocals actually switch up as well, which for me, I really liked the vocals. I thought they were additive. I really liked this person's voice. Track 2 had more of a reverb-soaked vocal that adds that kind of fog-filled 80s dance club under a full moon vibe. And he does a kind of breathy, ethereal vocal on track 3. Or, I'm sorry, on track 2. And then track 3...
What track 3 were you listening to?
Track 3 is more forward in the mix. And I thought it had this kind... Again, I've been watching these movies. I thought it had this kind of like Boris Karloff quality, in that it has a sort of unnerving and uncanny feeling to it. Sort of like he knows something that you don't, which I liked. And I also thought just being in Spanish actually elevates the music for me because it fits really well. And that seems kind of obvious or silly to say because, of course, they wrote the music around their language, but there are definitely bands, I think, that feel like they wrote the music and then they slapped some lyrics in there. Whereas these songs felt like the Spanish just slotted in really well and really complemented the flow and the pacing of the music. So I like that. Track 4, it gets us back closer to what you would expect out of a band like Rendezvous or French Police or something like that. But then it has this great chorus that melodically, it's not in a minor key, but there's something about it that is like off-putting or contrasting against the rest of the song, which I think is good because the verses are more of like a stereotypical modern post-punk song. And so I thought that doing that switching that up in the chorus gave the track a lot of texture. And I think that's what this album does really well, is these little flourishes and additions that are fairly minor, but I think create an overall effect of feeling fresh and unique. Like on track 5, there's bongos. They're not center stage. You get kind of a bonk and a slap here and there, a little roll or something like that. But again, you don't normally hear bongos or cowbell in post-punk. So it adds that depth and texture, which makes the track interesting. Track 6 mixes it up again with more of a 90s sounding synth. It's like I was desperately trying to find what band or song it reminded me of. The closest I got was Freak on a Leash by Korn, which is like close but not quite what I'm thinking of, but it sounds very familiar to me. But it's different from the rest of the album, so I liked it. Track 7 is another modern spooky post-punk song, and then track 8 is interesting because it has the Cure-inspired guitar tone and melody paired with the unique vocal, which on this track is more breathy and understated. And there's this sort of bright, sparkling synth that gets punctuated by more somber, dark-sounding bass lines. And I thought that song was just really well put together. It was interesting because taking the disparate parts separately, I feel like it could have kind of been a mess, but it all came together really well. And the cowbell comes back again, so that was good. So that's kind of my run through of the album. I think if I was going to rate it, I'd probably go with a 3 out of 5, slightly above average. Good, solid album, but I think part of what played into that is my being a little bit tired of that specific genre. So if this had been a few months ago, I probably would have rated it higher. So if you're into that, I think this is definitely something you want to check out.
Yeah, I thought maybe the previous conversation about Darkwave Burnout would have maybe come up with this review.
Yeah, it definitely, I felt it playing a role in how much I enjoyed this album, for sure.
I also did like this album. I agree that it was a solid piece of, I actually thought it was pretty solid goth rock in general. The drums were a little bit more death rocky, had a more punky edge, especially on the more up-tempo tracks. But the guitar, the bass tone was very goth rock. The vocals, as you said, were a standout. That's one of these things is not like the other kind of thing. They did lean more ethereal than goth rock. So it's kind of like goth rock guitar and bass with some death rock drumming and some ethereal vocals, all kind of mashed together in different balances from track to track. So, not all of them had, some of them were a little bit more goth rock, some of them were a little bit more industrial, a little bit more ethereal, a little more post-punk, even a little death rocky on occasion. So I thought it was an interesting mix of a lot of the big pillars of the goth music umbrella, so to speak.
Yeah.
For me, my track-by-track breakdown, so the first track, Fatiga, I really liked it. It kind of annoyed me at first, but I started to really like it. And it annoyed me because it's a bit of an earworm. It's kind of a catchy track that I had trouble shaking after I listened to it, because I listened to it several times just kind of in the background doing other things. And that's the track that kept sticking with me. Every time I'd like, I'm going to listen to the band again. And I start hearing the first song. The funny thing is some of the later songs, they're similar enough sort of sound that the singer his vocal lines tend to be, a line of words and then a pause. And then a line of words and a pause. There's some exceptions of it I'll go into when I touch on those, but a lot of them do that. And I find myself mentally adding every time there was a pause, Fatiga. And it worked. It worked on most of the songs. So I kept adding that to all of the other songs. It was just kind of a fun little earworm. So I enjoyed that. It's not my favorite track musically, but it's one that just stuck with me the most.
Interesting.
Second track, Soledad. What I found interesting, the first track was sort of a mid-tempo number.
Yeah.
The second track, huge spike in sort of tempo and energy. You kind of pointed that out, but it's a much faster track, getting a lot closer to that sort of death rock, punky, fast drumming, up-tempo vibe. But I did really like that song as well. One thing I didn't like about the first track was I found that the percussion or the rhythm section, both the bass and the drumming, was kind of boring. The vocals are the only thing that really grabbed me on that one. I mean, the guitar was fine. The guitar was solid, standard sort of chimey, jangly guitar.
Yeah.
But it was the vocals on that were interesting. They were ethereal, but they were actually not buried in reverb. So it was still pretty clear and easy to understand, even though my very, very rudimentary grasp of Spanish meant while I could hear each individual word, I only knew maybe a quarter of them. So I can kind of get what's being said. It wasn't enough to really do a lyrical analysis. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, I don't think that, the other Bandcamp page didn't have like lyrics included, because if they had lyrics, even if they weren't translated, I could have copied and threw them at Google and said, hey, give me what this is about. So I can only go by the titles, which single words, all very thematically similar. But I was enjoying the fact that two of them are actual meds rather than a condition or a emotional state.
Yeah.
So I thought that was fun. But yeah, the second track, definitely a lot faster, much more varied in the instrumentation. Things changed a lot, especially the percussion, which you already kind of noted. It's one of the reasons you liked it as much as you did, is because it was varied. But as you also noted, this one had much more buried vocals. This one, the vocals were really dialed back, piled on a little bit more reverb. They were harder for me to understand throughout. So I thought that was a bit of a negative, but it's a mood.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. Fluxatina, that was the other one that was a standout for me. This one, again, because of the vocals, and as you already mentioned, the very different vocal style. It's another up-tempo track, so we're sticking with up-tempo stuff. Had some really interesting sound design at the beginning. It didn't go throughout the whole thing, but it had much sort of a real noisy, grimy synth tone, sort of grinding away at the beginning as the intro comes in. But then it settles into this sort of interplay between guitar, bass, and organ, which I really loved. I thought that was a really neat combination of instruments. And then the vocals, kind of dovetailing on a little bit what we were talking about before, they almost entirely eschew any sort of melody or harmony. They are almost purely rhythmic. It's pretty much a monotone vocal line. There's almost no change in pitch other than the natural flow of, emphasis. Your voice raises and lowers in pitch a little bit as you emphasize or make something a question or make something the end of a statement. But overall, melodically speaking, it was pretty much the same note with just sort of a rhythmic emphasis to it. It's not to the degree that you would necessarily mistake it for rapping, but it's definitely heading in that direction, to my ear at least.
Yeah, I could see that.
So I thought that was really interesting. I did like that. I liked how that monotone vocal was layered over the more melodic interplay between the bass, the organ, and the guitar, with, again, a little bit more interesting. Most of the up-tempo tracks had a more interesting drum beat than the slower ones. So I thought that was a standout for me as well. Estrés, at this point, I was starting to get a little bit tired of the up-tempo stuff. It was all fast, and it was getting a little bit wearying. And part of that is because, part of what I listen to music is, will I dance to it or not? Yeah. And I don't tend to like to dance to up-tempo stuff as much. So I want to hear some variation. I like fast stuff, but I like it in juxtaposition with slow stuff. So this one was another up-tempo track. So I was kind of getting sick of the up-tempo at this point. However, one thing to talk about juxtaposition that I did like about this one is, even though it had a fast up-tempo musical basis, the vocals felt like it was half the time. They were a lot more drawn out. The words it wasn't a fast staccato rhythm like the previous one with the monotone rhythmic phrasing. This one felt like there was a juxtaposition between a slower vocal, it's prosody, but I'm trying to think of the actual the rhythm of the vocal was slower than the rhythm of the rest of the instruments. I thought there was an interesting juxtaposition. You had one layered on top of the other. Again, though, like track 2, they did pile on the effects on the vocals, so they were harder to understand, but that did kind of re-emphasize that sort of slow, like you said, foggy feel of the vocals on top of the little bit more up-tempo, frantic musical bed. So that was okay. I like that juxtaposition, but overall it didn't really stick with me other than that. Temblores, that one didn't really, there wasn't much about that one that did much for me. Some of the instrumental was decent. It was another up-tempo one. The vocals were more clear, again, not as varied, but still. Didn't really do anything. Had a couple of neat points. They had a really great part that I liked at the 2-minute mark. It was short-lived, but just after 2 minutes, everything dropped out except for basically the bass guitar and a synth line. And the bass guitar just sort of repeated a single monotone note for a while, and the synth was doing some weird things. There's a short little bridge section. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to lead anywhere. It did that for a little bit and then went right back to what it was doing prior to it, which I thought was a bit of a missed opportunity. I would have liked to see that transition into something a little different. Didn't need to be like a completely different thing.
Sure.
But going right back to what I felt was happening at the beginning, felt like it was a little bit of a lost opportunity with that really interesting transition that was setting it up to go almost anywhere.
Yeah.
Insomnio, this is the sort of an end or a break from the up-tempo section. It went back to sort of a mid-tempo track. I really enjoyed the guitar line at the beginning of the track. It had an interesting thing to it. I don't know if that's what was making you think of... This was one that made you sort of think of Freak on a Leash, right?
Yeah, it was a synth.
Yeah, I thought this was what
sound.
you said.
There was something about
the synth sound? Oh, okay. I'd have to listen to it from the synth standpoint, because I was enjoying the guitar tone. It had a really interesting, not the guitar tone. I liked the guitar tone throughout. The guitar tone was pretty consistent throughout, though. But the melodic line, especially in the intro, had this interesting thing. It was doing a repeated motif, and then it would jump up an octave to do a little bit of variation, then come back down. And I found that interesting. Yeah. Unfortunately, when it went into the verses, they cut out the high part and just sort of stayed on the low part, and it became kind of repetitive and monotonous. The interesting part came back a little bit later, again, during one of the bridge sections. But for the most part, in the verse sections, I found the instrumentation to be kind of boring and repetitive. But in those interim pieces, they did some more interesting things, and I kind of liked that. So then on to track 7, which is Panico.
Yes.
I thought this was getting sort of back into the up-tempo, the sort of standard up-tempo, and I found it was sort of triggering that same sort of, yeah, I've heard this before, vibe from some of the up-tempo tracks. I found some of the vocal work, some of the vocal melody lines interesting in this one, but other than that, really this one completely slipped from my mind for the most part. I have very little written about it. The last one, Lorazepam, I found this one particularly interesting because it was almost a happy track, which I guess for an anti-anxiety medication makes sense. But yeah, I thought this track, it was a tonal shift. It was relatively upbeat, and I thought almost had a sort of a happy vibe. You kind of ping down The Cure, and I kind of see, I mean, some of The Cure, of course, is very, very dark and dreary, but they do have their obviously happy moments too. As Robert Smith, I think recently, I don't know if he recently said, but I recently heard him say that he's been the lead singer of at least 4 bands that happen to be named The Cure.
Yeah, I saw that.
So I thought that was interesting, and I definitely agree with it, because I've always been sort of mystified with the Cure and the goth tag, because it makes sense for 1 or 2 of those 4 bands, but definitely not all of them. Though they're all great bands.
Yeah.
But Lorazepam reminds me of some of the more poppier, I guess the happier Cure songs. Not at the height of happiness. It's not a pop song by any stretch of the imagination, but I thought it was a little bit more upbeat. Had sort of a brighter tone to it. You kind of mentioned the sort of brighter, shimmery tone as well. But I thought that was a really interesting tonal shift to have at the end. Overall, I really liked it. I thought, it was nice to have a vocalist who felt like they were using their own voice and weren't trying to ape a stereotypical goth sound. They definitely felt like they had their own identity. I mean, it was definitely in the ethereal realm. Like I said, the vocals kind of were pulling from that ethereal side of goth, whereas the other pieces were pulling from different aspects of it. But it didn't sound like they were aping Cocteau Twins or Black Tape for a Blue Girl or Lycia or anything like that. They had their own sound, and some of that is probably the language. Like you mentioned, the language, of course, every language has its own cadence, its own prosody, and then, of course, different pronunciations for vowels gives it different color, different timbral variety. as you pronounce things differently, gives it its own unique identity.
That's why I like goth music in other languages. I know we talk, like when we talked to Jose, he mentioned that there can be, I think he mentioned it, that it can be a pressure to sing in English because you want to export your music. But I do think if you're composing music for your native language, in a established genre, it is more interesting to me because it does have create those subtle differences.
Yeah, I oftentimes, I listen to a lot of world music.
Yeah.
So I listen to a lot of music that I don't have the foggiest idea what they're saying. Spanish, I did take Spanish in high school. Most of the titles I knew what they were without having to look up translations. And if I could understand every few words, I can usually piece together kind of what they're singing about. So I could kind of get that. So I had a little bit of a half understanding, but even still, I was able to, I didn't know it well enough that I was so focused on lyrical content that I was listening to it as a poem. I was mostly listening to the lyrics, just like all the rest of the instruments, as another part of the musical fabric. And that's how I generally like to listen to world musics or musics that are outside, because it does trigger that sort of novel-seeking focus that I have when it comes to looking at art and experiencing art. So just having something that with a very different vocal quality is really nice. The other thing, which is kind of a trope, but is they can be really terrible lyrics, and I don't know any better.
Yeah. Like Blue Dangle, for example.
Perhaps that I was mostly going to point out the sort of parody of that concept that Tool did with their German song Die Eier von Satan, which is just a recipe spoken in German. Yeah. But because it's all sung in German, it doesn't sound like they're reading off a recipe. It's the eggs of Satan, but it's a recipe being sung to music. But it just sort of emphasized that idea that when you're listening to music in another language, if you don't know that language, they can be saying anything at all. And as long as it sounds cool, that's all that really matters. Yeah. Another good example of that is Cocteau Twins, where they're purposely not singing in any language. It's
God's language. They're speaking in tongues.
You'll hear what you'll hear. Sure, you go with that. But yeah, I've always enjoyed that, and I've enjoyed... The fun thing about that is it's close enough to English that I'm like, I think I can make out certain words, and everybody sort of makes up their own lyrics to their songs.
Yeah, that's always fun. I love that.
And I think that's a lot of fun. So it was really enjoyable to hear it in Spanish. I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, but that idea that it felt like it just fit, the music and the language fit together. I think I agree with that. I was thinking something along that lines when I was like, I wonder if we could translate these. And I was going with, of course, the first track, because that's the one that sticks in my mind. And the earworm part that sticks in my mind wouldn't work, because fatiga is 3 syllables, fatigue is not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So it would be completely bad. You'd have to think of another word that means something similar that still has that 3 syllables, but you'd also need to have the T sound and the G sound that give it the rhythmic element as well, or that hard rhythmic division, that it just works with the way fatigue is said. The Spanish word for it is spoken. Gives you that triple syllable with those hard breaking consonants. It gives it that rhythmic quality that I think is part of what made it stick in my mind so strongly that I added it to like half of the other songs. But overall, I think I'm going to agree with you on the rating as well. For me, I thought it was, like I said, a solid slab of enjoyable goth rock, post-punk, darkwave, however you want to put it. It reminded me mostly of goth rock, barring the vocals.
Yeah, definitely.
But with the bass and the guitars especially, really hit that. But overall, it just nothing stood out to me, nothing stuck with me. And as anyone who's listened to this podcast for more than 2 episodes know, that's a sticking point for me. If something doesn't really grab me with something novel, I kind of like, I don't get that excited about it. Yeah. But it's solid, so I definitely can't say it's below average. So I agree with you on the 3 ranking.
Wonderful. Always nice when we're in synchronicity. That's not the word I'm looking for. Synchronized is similar.
Simpatico.
Yeah.
I actually like it better when we disagree, but because I think it's a more interesting episode when we aren't.
Yep.
When it's not a circle jerk.
I was talking to Sarah about that, and I was saying the problem is I am conflict averse, and also Trey and I agree too much, and so I think our podcast is more boring than it needs to be.
It can be, though.
Like, I need to find a way to pick a fight. I usually
say that. Well, the thing is, I always pick a fight with that sort of offhanded comment in the last 5 minutes as you're trying to wrap up the episode.
Yeah.
I make some sort of offhanded comment that you're like, oh,
why now?
I want to talk about that, but Link has to be taken to bed. So we'll have to put a pin in that. And sometimes it gets picked up in the comments, like when Andy picked it up that one time when we had our musical debate, which turned out to be just a discussion of music history that we were both kind of agreeing on. But still, it did spark an interesting discussion.
So you've got to be interested in death. It's the last great taboo. It's the only taboo left.
Precisely. I mean, why is it, do you think, that everyone in here is dressed in black? It's a celebration of death.
No, I just like the clothes.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, the clothes look good. Yeah, I mean, death looks good. Charles Manson, yeah? No, he was cool.
Don't know if I mentioned it before, but I'm actually a vampire.
Sinister Suggestions.
I can't quite recommend it yet because I've only watched the first 2 episodes, but I just started watching Castlevania Nocturne.
Okay.
I think this came up actually in the episode with Connor and Lynn. I am a huge fan of Castlevania. The new season, the only thing I knew about it was everybody was excited because it featured Black and Indigenous characters. Okay. And I've watched the first 2 episodes and very good so far. So I don't have any kind of overview or anything other than so far I'm enjoying it. The thing I could actually recommend, I think, would be a show called Only Murders in the Building. Have you heard of this?
I have not heard of this.
So this show stars primarily Martin Short, Steve Martin, and Selena Gomez.
Okay, I have heard of it. Now that you say that, I remember something about Martin Short and Steve Martin in a thing about murders. So
essentially the premise of the show, and I'm recommending the first season specifically. Basically, it starts off, there's a murder in the building, so everybody's evacuated, and these 3 characters happen to be listening to the same podcast, which is a murder mystery podcast. So immediately that was kind of a fun idea that I'm watching a show about podcasts, which was, I like that. And they sort of have this kismet moment and find out, because they were sort of had this adversarial meeting in the elevator, and then they all sort of end up realizing, oh, we're into the same thing. And what happens is they end up forming their own podcast, and it's a true crime podcast about the murder in the building they were in. And they sort of become these amateur detectives and try to put this all together. And it is the first season specifically is so well written. I don't even like murder mysteries, but it is so goddamn good. It reminded me a lot of how much I enjoyed the first season of True Detective, as far as how good the writing is. Except this show it's not serious like True Detective is. It's full of levity and whimsy, which was really attractive to me because I can't deal with any heavy shit right now. But it really took me by surprise. It probably helped I had no expectations. But the dynamic between the 3 characters is fantastic. The mystery is so well written. Sarah, it was almost more fun sort of debating our theories about what might be happening between episodes with Sarah and I than actually watching the episodes. And we fucking watched we marathon through it in like a few days, which never happens. So it was very, very good. Unfortunately, the second season, it's funny, in the second season, they make a joke about how the follow-up season to a true crime podcast is never as good as the first one. And we haven't finished the second season. We kind of like watched half of it and then drifted off, which kind of sucks.
Yeah.
But that first season is like lightning in a bottle. It's so well put together. If you're looking for something, it's not goth related, obviously, but it's podcast related.
I mean, it is a true crime podcast, and there's an overlap in interest between true crime and goth. I certainly know a lot of goths who are into true crime.
Yeah, so very, very good. I would definitely recommend that show. And I think it's a few years old now, but if you haven't seen it, give it a look.
Looks like just a couple. Came out in 2021.
Yeah.
It's on Hulu for those who are looking for it. I'm actually really curious about how Selena Gomez held up. It's sort of one of these things is not like the other thing, both in age and in just what they're known for. Because Steve Martin and Martin Short are massive comedians, though Steve Martin's also almost more known as a musician these days, which I guess makes him similar to Selena Gomez. It makes Martin Short the one that sticks out. But still.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Martin was surprisingly like very down to earth and relatable and realistic.
He plays the straight man more often than not.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I haven't really seen him in much straight man stuff, but Selena Gomez, going into it also, I was like, you got a lot of work to do here. And it took me a little bit to sort of get into her character, maybe a couple episodes. But once it really gets going and you kind of understand who she is as a character, she fucking nails it. She's fantastic. And actually in the second season, I think she's my favorite character in the show, actually. So she knocked it out of the park. She did a really good job.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, Steve Martin's one of my favorite comedic actors.
Yeah.
Just has always been. So, and I've seen a ton of his stuff.
Yeah.
So I love Steve Martin. He's also an amazing bluegrass banjo player.
Yeah.
So I enjoy him in that too. And I've always liked Martin Short as well.
Yeah, he's great. And Martin Short in this is because it is very grounded, but he is more of when there needs to be a more dramatic over the top character, he is the one. And he does a really good job. So that's Martin Short in a nutshell. He usually is that sort of kind of high strung, over dramatic character in a lot of the stuff he does. It's so good. Honestly, I would rewatch that first season right now. It's very good. So
I may have to look it up because Hulu can be watched ad supported for free, right?
As far as I know, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I may look it up, check out a couple of the episodes.
We've got my brother-in-law's account, so that's how most of our streaming accounts are family members logins. So
sure.
Well, time for something new and something old at the same time. That would be a new album from fucking Rubella Ballet. If you're not familiar, they formed in 1979, and I always thought of them as a pseudo anarcho-punk band because they definitely had goth and death rock aspects that meshed into predominantly punk sounds. You'd probably recognize them visually because they always wore these neon day-glow outfits that set them apart from everybody else in the scene. They're kind of one of those bands like Rudimentary Peni or TSOL who were punk, but always had some goth and death rock fan crossover. And in that lineage, we get a really eclectic album this time around. There's the frenetic anarcho-punk for fans of that. There's slowed down sludge metal inspired sounds. And surprisingly, they jump into industrial metal as well, which was an unexpected throwback and added a lot of welcome diversity to the album. There's also a great variety of metal and twangy and punk guitar solos throughout the album. Really, the anarcho part of anarcho-punk is on display here because they break and bend the quote-unquote rules of punk. It's really fun and engaging to listen through this album, and of course it's political and belligerent from head to toe, which is also a welcome element for me. From Belfast comes Psychodrama with their new single, The Heretic. And this track sounds to me like a blend of synth-pop bands like Cruise Shadows and Informatic with this sort of late 90s goth sound that got really popular at the time. I would probably point to bands like Pretentious Moi or The House of Usher. Plenty of reverb, haunting guitar, guttural bass, lush, melancholic vocals, and mechanistic drum machine that's reminiscent of the Sisters. The track really feels like a fusion of several different eras and sounds in a way that makes my brain tingle. On the shoegaze dream pop side of the spectrum is the new release from She's in Parties out of Colchester. Clearly, there's some inspiration from Goth. Right off the bat, the name is lifted from a Bauhaus track. As of this recording, there are 2 tracks available to listen to off their EP titled End Scene. Overall, they're bright and punchy. There's a clear pop sensibility in the sort of light, melodious choruses. However, the 2 tracks remain complex and textured as well. The track Summer Haze feels like what would happen if you could distill sunlight into a candy, while the track L Word feels much more like a somber walk through the city at dusk. The EP oozes nostalgia and emotion, and despite not being a goth album, there's clear influence from artists like The Cure and 90s ethereal music, such as An April March or Autumn's Grey Solace. So if you're like me, and one of the genres you've dived into has been 90s ethereal, this is definitely a band you want to check out. Dividing Lines is a death rock and punk band from Germany, and I think a great example of the diversity available under the death rock genre. Their Bandcamp page says, quote, "Please don't listen to our music if you're a fucking racist, fascist, homophobe, or anti-feminist. Nazi punks, fuck off." And that's just as applicable a slogan for this podcast, I'd say. The band uses a guitar tone similar to Horror Vacui, or maybe Scarlet's Remains. It's sharp, raw, and in your face, but the tracks are punctuated by all manner of nuances, like blues-inspired guitar solos and industrial synth lines. The track Gravedigger oozes moss and peat and dirt, while the track Dance feels grandiose and epic, like Dracula's castle on a stormy night. It's something I love about modern death rock. You have bands doing takes on a classic sound, but you have all manner of emerging play with death rock. This band, to me, feels like it fits into a category with Nox Novacula and Witch Hands, with its tendency towards pulling from heavy, filthy rock music and some 80s metal bands, rather than from dark punk or something carnivalesque. Vocally, the singer reminds me of Scary Bitches, weirdly enough, and I mean that in a good way. It's harsh and earnest, and every so often you'll get a male backup vocal that's a bit more spoken word. The new EP from Moon Vampire out of Slovakia is titled Forest and a Victim, 2 Bites. For me, the first track on this EP is a contender for a modern successor to Bloodsucker by Paralyzed Age. It's on the nose in the best way possible. It's got bouncy, warbling synth and reverbed drums. There's almost a shoegaze influence to the track with sounds in the lineage of Drab Majesty's style of Darkwave. Vocally, there's no comparison to Paralyzed Age, as the vocals sit in the back of the mix, as if covered in the evening fog of an Eastern European town. The lyrics are fantastic. The perfect amount of vampire cheese, gothic ephemera, and earnest desire. The second track has bat samples on it, which is fucking great. It's much more laid back, but reminds me of the ambient music from Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It's a killer EP overall. If you're a fan of goth music about vampires, you definitely don't want to pass this one up. From LA is the Friction Substance Split EP. It starts off with 2 tracks from Friction, which is much more the oi punk side of the spectrum, sort of like a Cockney Rejects kind of thing. It's bouncy, gritty, and feels like rolling around in the dust. The second band, Substance, which is a name I always associate with Joy Division, is far more mellow and moody. Raw guitar is forward in the mix, so you can really feel it in your bones, with a droning, angsty vocal that makes you question if you were ever actually happy. It's a great little split with an interesting diversity between the 2 bands that still ends up playing off of each other despite the differences. Peach Gardens is a shoegaze band from Moscow, and their album In Time and Eternity is focused on dreams as a dimension that exists entwined with our waking lives. The album opens with the feeling of floating on cotton candy clouds through an Elysian paradise. The instrumentation has that opaque, cloudy smear effect that evokes the sensation of the world being super real and surreal simultaneously. Vocals sit in the back of the mix like heavenly deities exclaiming from the cosmos. The lyrics, of course, play into the emotion of idyllic and unreal landscapes as the sounds cradle you snugly through your trip. A perfect soundtrack through which to explore higher realms of consciousness. Alright, I know what you're thinking. There's been a whole lot of music, but nothing that's proper goth. I can hear you, sneering elitist from the 90s. Well, Endlos out of Italy should fill that void for you. Their new album, Dark Fields, is their first full length, and there's a whole range of style on display. Western-influenced twang, Bowie-influenced glam infusion, sharp, acerbic, death rock-inspired tracks, and plenty of 90s goth rock inspiration from the likes of Corpus Delicti. The vocals may put some people off. It's not the typical eldritch clone. It's not a deep, resonant, mystical baritone. I'd say it's closer to something like the House of Usher, with some definite Bowie and Roz influence. In my mind, the album effortlessly blends genre, from hypnotic rhythmic drumming on the track Winter Rose, which is reminiscent of Sex Gang Children, to the more straight death rock inspired tracks like Nothing Remains, which brings to mind shades of Bat Nouveau. It's a killer modern goth rock album that I definitely recommend. Sex Code is out of Spain, and their new album, Pleasure, is straight-up modern darkwave with an industrial edge. Melody has always been the most important aspect of electronic music in my mind. I'm biased towards soaring, nostalgic, emotional synth work, and this album is full of it. It's a three-piece band whose single came out this year, and for me, this is an example of a darkwave band that's not phoning it in or being derivative for the sake of putting out music. The vocalist has a beautiful accent that adds a delightful texture to the music, and really it's always nice to hear a vocalist that is very clearly not sounding like an American. Because even some European bands just have a general tone to their vocals that sounds like they could be from America, and I like the flavor brought to a song through different vocal inflections and tones. The album itself is dancey from start to finish with plenty of interesting synth lines that vary widely enough from track to track to keep me interested. There's some harsher industrial tones, Italo-disco influence, and even some poppier electro-pop style melodies, as well as some stuff that I found reminiscent of like VNV Nation, such as the track Beneath. If you're looking for a darkwave act, then Sex Code is my pick for this episode. Finally, if you're looking for something in the vein of actors, then Attic Eyes has you covered. From Tennessee, their new eponymous EP is bombastic and polished in all the right ways. The vocals are reminiscent of Marky Moon. It's an earnest, emotive, and powerful vocal that I really love. It's one of those stage bands to me, in that it feels like you're watching them play under sparkling lights, covered in sweat, lost in a crowd of moving bodies, undulating endlessly. There's a grandiosity to the music, even when they're trying to be understated. Like with the track Seer, which feels like a late-night cruise kind of track. but tracks like Moon emit all the power and deific splendor as is deserved of the moon itself. There's plenty of bass guitar and vocal flourish and diversity throughout the album to keep you engaged. And that brings us to the end of another episode. Next month, we will be returning to speak with Dr. Jordan Soper. She is a Goth and an ABPP-CST licensed psychologist, a board-certified behavioral and cognitive psychologist, and an AASECT certified sex therapist. So we're going to be talking about a range of subjects. We'll be talking about if Goths are more predisposed to self-harm and depression, and we'll be talking about a whole range of sex topics, among other things. So I hope you'll return. Make sure you're subscribed, you have notifications on for whatever app you're using, and we'll return for another deep dive into the experiences of Goths. As always, thank you so much for listening and spending your time with us. If you are so inclined, feel free to check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions. It keeps the lights on and keeps my family fed and our bills paid. So if you appreciate this kind of content and want to support more of it, consider checking out the Patreon and seeing what kind of rewards you can get for supporting our podcast. With that said, cherish every moment of the rest of this autumn and Halloween season. I hope you're able to make time for as much spooky shenanigans as possible. So until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of the Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.